Um, and let me share that icebreaker question. And Kate, I'm going to warn you, you're going to be first up. So
Okay.
the question I've got for both of you as you do your introduction is going to be, what's the one thing that needs to happen before a founder or founding team even thinks about hiring their first head of sales? Kate Jensen, welcome to today's call, and take it away.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll introduce myself first so I can give myself a little time to think about that one thing. I currently do sales and partnerships at Anthropic. Before that, I was at Stripe for about 8 years, where I had a whole bunch of different roles, but most recently led the platform sales organization that's embedding payments into software products. And before that, I was at Google in the very early days of Google Cloud and Google Apps for Business. I'm so excited to be here. There are so many great questions that we're about to talk through. I think to answer your icebreaker, the number one thing every founder should do is close at least one deal. It sounds so obvious, but understand what you're selling and who you're probably going to be selling to. It's the most important thing before you try to scale up.
Nice, thanks, Kate. And Paul, welcome.
Yeah, great. Yeah, hi, great to be here. I'm Paul Fifield. I've been an entrepreneur for the last 25 years, founding 4 companies in that time, and I joined one as a CRO. Combined revenue across those companies is about 200 million, and I've raised over 100 million in venture capital. So I've done the 0 to 1 million 5 times in that time, and the last one was actually a few years ago. So it's quite sort of fresh in my mind. And all have been British companies that have expanded to the US, and I've built multiple sales teams in the US and Europe. And now I'm retired as an entrepreneur, and I help founders, I coach founders. Obviously, love my work at Bessemer, helping some of the early stage investee companies on things like go-to-market. And I've also started my first deal-by-deal seed fund. So we invest on a deal-by-deal basis into UK companies that have secured a tier 1 lead. That's me. I think in terms of the one thing, I would say a mistake I often see in early stage companies is actually people hire that VP of sales way too early. And I think we're going to sort of perhaps unpack this a bit more in the session today. But I'd say if you are looking to hire them, you should have significant traction, revenue traction, multiple hundreds of thousands, probably closing in on that million, and also very strong retention. You certainly don't want to have a leaky bucket as you're hiring a very expensive VP of sales. So that's all I'd say. That's probably 2 things instead of 1 thing, but anyway, hopefully you get the point.
Yeah, actually, Paul, I think this is a little bit of a trick question, right? For your head of sales, and I think you both kind of referred to this. Like, so who should your first sales hire be? Let's say, Kate, you've closed, you're an entrepreneur, you closed 1 deal or many. Who should we hire first and why?
Well, I will say, first and foremost, I very much agree with Paul. Your first hire is not a VP of sales for a couple of reasons. 1, giving out titles too early can be a dangerous precedent to set. And 2, you don't necessarily want someone who's going to build out a team immediately. You want someone who's going to be on the ground selling. And really what you want is someone who has the skills to sell, because sales is a skill. But it's also really exciting about company building, finding patterns, building playbooks, starting to understand where there's really big opportunity in market. And so finding those early learners and company builders is so important, but you really need the on-the-ground talent first.
Yep. Paul, you've gone through this multiple times. Like, how do I find that person? It sounds like a unicorn, right? They want to be the first salesperson somewhere. They're hired by a founder. How does this work?
Well, I've got a mildly contrarian kind of view. Actually, it's probably not that contrarian, but actually, I do think the first sales guy. So let's assume you've done founder-led sales, and I totally agree with Kate. The founder's got to sell your first customers, right? 5, 10, 20 customers really should be driven by the founder. And as a brief aside, sometimes I hear founders say, "I'm not any good at sales. I can't do sales." and I literally hit back and say, I think you've just sold 20% of your company to a venture capitalist for X millions. I think you can probably sell. But I actually think, let's say that the founder has achieved maybe 10, 15, 20 sort of customers. I actually think the first hire is a customer success rep, because I think everyone keeps thinking about more sales, more revenue, but actually you've got some customers. You need to learn from them. You need to make sure they're the right customers. There's so, like, you can get case studies out of them. You need to love them because they've sort of backed you a little bit, because you're very kind of early stage. So my personal belief is the first hire is actually a CS rep.
Yeah, I buy that. Yeah, and so, but let's play that through. If I've hired the CS rep, and now it's time to hire somebody in sales, like what do they do? And let me start with you, Kate, and then Paul, you can add in. And I'm really curious, having worked with in this stage, how does it transition from the founder? They usually do more than one deal, Kate, but I get your point.
Yeah.
But how a good founder isn't going to let go 100%, but they're not also going to keep it 100%. So who do they hire, and what are their responsibilities?
And you're absolutely right. A good founder is always going to do a whole lot more than one deal. But I similarly advise companies and hear all the time, I don't even want to sell at all. And that's just not the right answer. You have to be in the deals, understanding your customers really closely. And Paul, you mentioned hiring your first hire as CSM. Go learn from them which customers you like the most, which customers are the easiest to support, which customers seem most naturally a good fit for your product, are likely to grow over time. That's where your first sales hire should really be spending time, understanding that, finding some patterns, and then either managing, hopefully, a massive inbound flood, or matching patterns on customers and doing some outbound from the early days. But really getting deep and understanding those patterns and what seems to be working, and where you may be investing a little bit too much effort, energy, time for the return that you're getting from customers. Try to avoid that from the outset, because you can set yourself up for a really tough time if you lean into customers that are too expensive. And then to answer your second question about where do founders lean in, ideally you're co-selling. There is no better salesperson at any company than the founder to talk about why they founded the company, their vision. This is true no matter how many millions of dollars or billions of dollars you have in revenue. And so finding someone who can partner with founders closely and knows when to bring them into a conversation, but can also manage most of the cycle, it's really important.
Yeah, thanks. Paul?
Yeah, no, so I couldn't agree more. And I think if founders are thinking, oh, I'll do sales until this point, and then I'm never going to do sales ever again, it's absolutely the wrong thought process. As Kate said, even at multiple billions. I mean, I think, there's lots of stories, even Mark over at Salesforce, staying very, very close to customers and being very involved in sales, even at multiple billions in revenue. I think there's another kind of interesting phrase I heard a long time ago. I think it's very relevant to this conversation, which is your early customers are buying into the same thing that your early stage VC is actually buying into, right? Which is why it's so important that those early sales comes from the founder, because those early stage customers, they need to believe that, because they're taking a risk, right? You're an early stage company. They need to see the passion, the belief, the vision from the founder, and that's essentially what they're buying into, right? Because they've got to trust that this founder is going to actually deliver on what he or she is promising. So I think that they're going to the question of like the sort of order of hiring. I do think like go to market's really hard when you know what you're doing, right? I think it's almost impossible, right? When you haven't got any experience. And I've quite for a long time been sort of struggling on how does that founder go from, leading founder-led sales, knowing that it's too early to get a VP of sales, but then having to then go and hire maybe a couple of SDRs, a couple of AEs. They've never even written a job description for an SDR, right? They don't know how to compensate them. It's just really, really tough. But I think I've found the hack for this, which is I'm a really big fan of fractional revenue leadership. And so it's really quick. You're not running a big expensive hiring process where you're potentially paying 40, 50, 60,000 plus dollars in recruiting fees. There's no kind of equity, and you literally you work for someone on essentially a day rate for, let's say, 2 days a week, and they help you to then build that those first reps, right? And the classic for a sort of mid-market or enterprise motion is probably, I still think, 2 SDRs to 2 AEs, and hiring in twos I think is better than hiring in ones, because you can learn a lot more and you sort of de-risk it a little bit. But I think actually getting a fractional person in who can do all of that early team building is incredibly valuable, and just helps the founder. It's just less stressful for the founder. It's less risky. And they'll make sure the compensation is right. They'll make sure there's basic stage processes are kind of all right. And they'll make sure they're hiring the right profile of rep, which is really important as well.
I think anybody who's a fractional CRO on this call today is enjoying hearing that. Where do I find a fractional CRO, Paul, Kate? Do I Google for it? Like, where do I find my network for this if I'm trying to find that elusive hire?
Call you. Paul, you're the one who just said this. Their founders, their first sale, almost always, maybe a few customers, but one of their biggest massive deals is going to be their early rounds fundraising. And that's exactly what a great VC is meant to do, is to help find the right people to support. That doesn't always necessarily mean full-time hires. It can mean advisors and other people to help.
Yeah. I mean, this is true even in our Bessemer go-to-market community. A few of the CROs that support our portfolio companies are fractional CROs. I want to tie a bow on this, and then I'm going to jump into a next topic. It's a little tactical, but it was Paul's hiring in pairs comment. But I want to close this with this topic with, as the founder who's doing these first sales, it's kind of all in your head. And what you're trying to do when somebody's helping you and it's passing through this phase, Paul just said, to me, the key part is you're writing it down. What's the ideal customer profile? What's the pitch? What's the value proposition we're trying to add? In a way, some of these early customers buy from you as a founder because of your vision and the things Paul shared. And a good test when you bring on a sales team is it isn't the founder that the person's meeting with. So there better really be a business problem, and it better be well documented and stated. And that what you're trying to do is debug and create some repeatability. Because remember, one of the panelists said at the beginning, I'll know it's time to hire a VP of sales when you have a repeatable motion going. And that handoff is where you're trying to test how repeatable is this? What's my target customer? What's my differentiation? What's the business problem we're solving for a customer? Yes, that makes sense, panelists? So sometimes I see people hire too small. We just hired one person. We don't know if it was right or wrong. And I also see when people hire too big. We hired 5 people all at once, and we haven't documented what the process is. Paul mentioned hiring in pairs, and I agree with that, but I want to slow down and explain the pros and cons and maybe some stories you both had and or scar tissue around this. Paul, I'm going to have you go first because you mentioned it, and I'm going to give Kate some time to think of some stories. But Paul, what problem am I solving when I hire people in pairs?
I think if you just hire one person, right, there's a risk if that person doesn't work out, then you're back to zero. So that's kind of one. I think the second piece is actually is team dynamics and team learning. It's much better if you have two people together. And I think if you again with SDRs, it's a pretty tough job building pipeline. And having a buddy, right, that you're kind of working with, I think is really important. And also, it's difficult to know what good looks like if you only have a data point of one, right? So the other challenge with super early stage, it's quite hard to create a fair sort of compensation. You don't quite know what the targets should be because you've never sold this thing. Thing before. So all those things are quite hard and you have to be quite dynamic, which is why it's important to get people that have, I think, done this stage before, have worked in super early stage, are very comfortable with ambiguity and a lack of structure and all that kind of stuff. But I think that, yeah, you don't know what kind of good looks like. And if you have two people, two SDRs, two AEs, you might have one SDR that's creating 15 SQOs for you and another one that's creating 5. And so you can start to sort of judge what good looks like because you can start to see it. So there are some of the reasons.
Yeah. Kate, anything you want to add to that?
Paul, I think you nailed the most important ones. I'll add one that sounds a little bit fluffy, but is so important. It's just more fun to have someone to work with. And having a great culture and having a culture where people are building off each other in terms of energy could be so important. And so being completely alone trying to figure something out would be kind of boring. And so it's important to really build that energy and be deliberate about it.
Yeah.
I think as well.
Go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, Jen, I was just going to say, saying, sales is hard, right? It's never easy. And there are some low moments, right, where you just feel beaten up and it's not working. And yeah, to your point, Kate, I think those moments it's also really important to have, to be in a bit of a team.
Yeah. I summarize that, Kate, under I need a kindred spirit to
exactly.
Right. The only thing I would add to this top thing is, good sales teams have a healthy competition. And one of the things I like about hiring in pairs is they both feel healthy pressure to do whatever it is first. Like, that person has this many SQOs. I need to get to some of those. We've sourced this. And I mean that in a healthy way, not in an unhealthy way. Okay, I want to pivot now and talk a little bit about something that I think can be a little strategic. And that is a sense of how you advise these early stage founders to build their sales strategy and channel. Like they need to figure out what the right sales model is right for their business. Paul, you talked about SDRs and BDRs. We've also talked about product-led growth. If you're coaching a founder, how would you advise them on what figuring out the right sales model is for their business? Anybody want to take that first?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think that what I find kind of interesting in the whole world of advice and advisory stuff is that there's one size kind of fits all advice, and I don't think it's particularly helpful. And I think I think the way that I would work with a founder in terms of advising them on a sales strategy is understand your motion, right? Are you an SMB? Are you a mid-market or are you enterprise, right? They're the three sort of common buckets because the dynamics, the cost structure, the everything changes so dramatically for those different motions. An enterprise sales rep, I don't know, what would an enterprise rep cost in San Francisco right now, Kate?
About 500K OTE.
Exactly. But if you got an SMB motion where perhaps your ACV is under $5,000 a year, you're probably talking about an inside sales rep that's going to be, maximum 100 OTE?
Around
straight away. Yeah, right. So straight away, you've got such a huge difference in cost structure, sales cycles, like everything around it, demand gen changes. So understand which motion you have and then start to build around that and absolutely nail your ICP. And I love this phrase, uncomfortably narrow, when talking to founders about ICP. You should feel a bit uncomfortable that your target market is like kind of almost too small, and be scrappy. The number of times I hear founders, very, very smart, intelligent founders, overthinking everything and not moving. It's like you've got to get out there in the early stages and you've got to find those leads somehow. You've got to sweat networks, but just be scrappy. Don't over worry about your sales stages. And even like I've heard founders with no revenue saying, I'm looking for repeatability. I'm like, no, you're not. You're looking for customers really quickly. And so I think, be super scrappy as well is what I encourage founders to be.
I couldn't agree with that. Focus as much as you possibly can and then build on that as you learn. Tony, you asked about channel, and I'll use two examples from my own experience. One, right now at Anthropic, we signed these really incredible and huge opportunity partnerships with Amazon and Google. And that opens up a pretty massive distribution channel for us. But how to manage those partnerships, how to co-sell, that opens up a whole lot of questions, and how to take a tiny team and map to sales teams of tens of thousands of people. I'm sure you can imagine how fun some of these conversations have been on our side with like, we can't take every call, help us figure out how to prioritize. Champagne problems in a lot of ways, but figuring out how to do that maniacal focus is really difficult if you sign up for something that scales you that quickly. On the counterexample at Stripe, we actually realized that we had this platform business. You could have called this a channel business in a lot of ways. You think I sell Stripe to Shopify. Shopify Pay is powered by Stripe in the back end. Think about the distribution when Shopify is able to go sell that product to all of their customers. And that was something that really evolved quite naturally. We had a maniacal focus on tech-forward developers who could integrate payments well. And it turned out that some of those developers were part of companies that brought us enormous scale. And so I don't think you necessarily have to plan your channel strategy from day one. I think it can really evolve from the focus that you have early.
Okay, do you think those startups maybe try and develop channel maybe a bit too early, thinking that it's maybe the easier way of driving revenue?
I think sometimes, because it's really easy to underestimate how much effort in resourcing and different teams and different people are required to maintain these partnerships. And figuring out how to measure their success in the short, medium, and long term is also pretty tricky as well. We're living through it.
I think as well, you almost lose a bit of the control as well. Like it's quite hard to sort of build predictability in a channel motion. And I think you might even learn a bit less about your ICPs. And it's so critical that you have a hypothesis on your ICP and you either prove or disprove it really rapidly. And if you're maybe 1 or 2 steps away, then actually perhaps your learning curve is a bit shorter as well.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I mean, this is pretty neat. And maybe one piece of advice I share a lot with early stage companies is they'll have a discussion on what's our sales motion or what's our sales process. And I would reverse engineer that by saying, tell me about your buyers and what's their buying process. And then how do you want to match a sales motion to their buying process? And so for, should I be PLG or direct sales? The answer is, well, what's your product and how do people want to buy that? My guess is if it's Anthropic and it's a lot of developers that don't want to talk to humans, probably a PLG led with some sales might be a way to go. And when it's very unique and hard to explain and not an online solution, you might need more of a B2B motion. And the other piece of experience I have is channels are good at fulfilling demand when it exists. But when we're starting new categories of companies, there's not that demand yet. And Paul, that's why I really love your comment about, you're going to lose touch with your ICP. It's only when, man, there's just so much coming in. We need the channel to do it efficiently. It's too important to delegate to another company probably at this stage, unless it's really a perfect attachment. Like I think a Shopify and Stripe example you gave, Kate, is pretty darn perfect.
It turns out they were a great partner of Stripes, and they still are. I want to add to one thing that you said, which is being customer obsessed as you're thinking about designing your sales process. And it's not just who's buying the product, but who has to be involved and who should be involved in deploying it and making sure that it goes well at the end. Thinking through the full sales cycle, not just to a signature, is so important when you're designing who to hire and what your overall sales process should be. It sounds really obvious, but I can't tell you how many folks I talk to who are focused on the signature and not necessarily the longer term deployment. It goes back to what you said about CSs, Paul.
Yeah, it's a bit CS, and also that CS person can in the early days double up as an onboarding specialist as well, and that's absolutely crucial. There's a really interesting thing I think to think about when you do win a customer and they go live is, the Stage 2 Capital talk about this leading indicator of customer success. And it's like, what kind of actions or metrics do we want the customer to take in the first 60 days that's going to give us a very high confidence that they're going to be a multi-year, happy customer. And I think Slack has had like 2,000 messages sent in 30 days. I think Facebook had one. I know HubSpot had another one, which was at some point in their journey, which was 5 of the 20 apps that are used in the first 60 days means that they're going to be a multi-year customer. So I think thinking about what are those actions that you want the customer to take to make them a very valuable customer where they're getting true value from your product is really, really important thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there'll be no flywheel on sales if there's not customer success, because the way you're going to scale is telling the stories of what prior customers have done that have impacted their business positively. I'm with you on it. I want to have a chance to maybe brag or share some success stories of what good looks like. You both have been part of these revenue teams that have gone through it. Paul founded 4 different companies. You said you've been in this journey 5 times. What stories of what it looks like when it's running well can you share, and any specific examples or tips you have? I think the audience would love. And Kate, do you want to go first?
Sure. What it looks like when it's going well is you have a really engaged team that's sharing what they're learning all the time. It's truly remarkable how much just feeling the energy of a team is a predictor of whether or not that team is going to do well or not. And so I'm simplifying pretty dramatically, but I think that's really important. And when you have a team that's very high energy and really customer obsessed, really, really learning, the customers end up being your best salespeople. They end up selling with you for the next 5 deals. And that's just where you get a flywheel that works quite well.
And Paul?
Great. So I'm going to be a bit tactical with this one. So when I was building my last company, it's called Sales Impact Academy. It's still going. We were backed by MIT, Stage 2 Capital. We're also an investor. And something that we did, which worked incredibly well, and this is going to sound a bit perhaps simple, but it's just so effective, is that we leveraged webinars like unbelievably. And I actually love operationalizing, creating demand around webinars, right? It's this is not new to anyone, but leading in sales, if you lead with value, then that's a much better way than just leading with, I want a meeting, right? Which is basically what SDRs are doing every day. What I love about the using a really high quality webinar that is going to add value to your prospects. What people think about with webinars is that it's an inbound motion, but actually you can turn it into a very targeted outbound motion, right? You can create these. I like to create them on a monthly basis. You can even do it on a 2-weekly basis. You know the ICP you're going after, you know exactly the persona. You make sure you get some amazing people and the editorial's correct. And then you do very, very targeted outbound to your exact ICP and the personas that you're after, and you're inviting them to a high quality event. Now that is a very different outbound motion than I want a meeting. Yeah. And for me, you then earn the right to then push them, if you like, into a sales cycle, right? Because now they've heard about your brand, they've got value, and they'll be way more open to then talking about what it is that you're selling. And the other great thing about webinars is it's great for brand. So you start to build awareness. It's kind of like the sort of silver bullet for me, because you're building awareness. It's a really smart way of doing outbound, and you build pipeline, and you build audience, because you're collecting, hundreds, if not thousands, of email addresses over time. So that would be my tactical. I just absolutely love it, and it works an absolute treat in my last company.
Yeah. Can I add one piece to that for you, Paul, or reinforce one piece? Like that, when you're doing that, you're also helping your customers sell for you. And because they're on that webinar explaining what they did and the impact it made. And really, when we're selling, people don't, when you and I sell, people put their defense shields up. And then when our customer says the same thing, the defense shields are down. So just remember, like, especially you founders on the call, when you speak, to a prospect, you're a founder, and they treat you differently than they treat Tony, the sales rep. Because when Tony, the sales rep, says the same thing, the defense shield is up. And that's one reason why a lot of founders say, well, how come the reps aren't getting the meetings and the positive feedback I'm getting? Because they're not a founder. And then I'll add one other small but important tactical tip in this stage that I've just seen work multiple times is, as a founder, you're positioning TAM and big market changes. But the part you want to repeat with your team is a very specific problem that we're solving for your ideal customer. I want to give an example, and that one you're trying to repeat over and over again. So I worked for an early stage data integration company. We could integrate any kind of data into apps, but once we had one successful customer, and we had one that was doing it in a medical application system that's a very small TAM, and they're using a standard called HIPAA. And we knew that we started going after everybody else like that had that problem, and we kind of had the use case of HIPAA for our big data integration platform. And we had the reps repeat that until we knew we had it working. And I would say 80% of our effort was repeating the one use case that we had, and only 20% was finding the next new one. And our founder worked on the next new one while our sales team repeated the one that worked. And when we had that working, we had the sales team add in the second use case, which is around a mortgage industry standard called MISMO. And this is, blood and gut stuff, but the team repeats what works, and the early team kind of finds the new one that we want to repeat. And you're going to find those over time. And that's how we start to build some repeatability. Kate, I saw you nodding. Is there something you wanted to add there?
Just to something you said earlier, reiterating, there are a couple things on, Paul, what you were talking about with these webinars. One, this is a really great way to get founders back involved in the sale. Tony, you mentioned this too. Bringing a founder on board to a webinar, it's a pretty light lift for them. It's very scaled, but it helps people bring their guard down in a very meaningful way. And then two, you can have webinars that are across different sales cycle. And we used to do this quite a bit at Stripe, especially. But one of the places we found them to be most successful was advice for deployments. So it wasn't even necessarily really early funnel. It was kind of more mid funnel, right? As you're signing a contract, companies who know they're going to invest in you or your product, but want to make sure they're getting the most out of it. You can actually be more specific about exactly what topics they want to learn about, and we found those to be even more impactful than just pipeline building.
Yeah. And they also don't have to be related to your product at all, right? They can just be what's going to be creating value for my prospects. That's how you got to be thinking. What kind of individuals would they absolutely love to see? And so I think for me it was always what are the wow names that we can get, and then what's the actual editorial topic? Get those two right, and you will. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. We're coming up on 35 to 40 minutes in, and I promised the audience that we would spend more time on their questions at this point. And we can each see the Q&A. So I tell you what, I'm going to find one of the questions here, and I'm going to ask of the audience. And then Paul and Kate, while I do that, I want you to pick a couple that you can lead into next. Because I know you have a point of view on so many of these. And one is I'm going to mention a question here from Justin Manduke. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. And he says, I'd love to get the team's take in the enterprise space where your first $1 million could mean just 2 to 3 customers or less. What does sales look like in that journey to 7 figures? What does a product look like at that stage? How important is co-development with customers? And how does that impact the go-to-market strategy as we go through that experience? So larger ticket sales, customers wanting some co-development, trying to get to multi-$100,000 ACV deals and $1 million in sales. Either of you want to take a stab at this one first?
I'll take a stab at this one. I think your early customers, especially if you're going enterprise first, you should expect that you will be co-developing with them. The extent to which you're co-developing in a way that is not aligned with what your roadmap already was, that's when you should start to worry. But for these early deals, we talked about this multiple times. What you're really selling in especially founder-led sales, what you're really selling is your vision as a company. And so your early customers should help you to achieve that vision and give you some really good customer support when you're selling it to the next company and the next company. But if you are co-developing and doing a whole lot of work that wasn't necessarily on your original roadmap, that again, I would avoid that.
So can you give a specific example? I could kind of think of some, but like I could see it accelerating the roadmap.
I can give an
And sometimes
example.
there's things that.
Oh, please go ahead.
No,
I can
after
give an
you.
example of a deal we walked away from actually at Stripe. We had talked to a company for months. We were really excited. We thought we were very on board. It was going to be a very early omni-channel deal. Omni-channel for us was online payments plus offline payments. And Stripe had just acquired a company called Index at the time. We had just started to release our offline payments, our product. I'll keep this short, I promise. But basically, we had a plan for this product. We had a plan for what we wanted it to be, and we knew there were going to be some gaps in what it was going to be able to do. I won't go bore you with the details, but as we got further down the path, we realized that this customer really wanted us to close all of those gaps. And that had been a very deliberate part of our strategy not to invest there. And I was really proud of the team, and John and Patrick were involved, and we decided to walk away because we knew that we had a really good vision for what this omni-channel solution was going to be, and we really stuck to it.
Nice. Thanks for bringing it to life with a real example.
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah. Maybe an unhelpful answer, but if you can avoid going enterprise first, I would. And maybe you can't, and that's totally fine. But some of the tricky things are some of the sort of potholes. Is you've got revenue concentration problem like out the gate, right? So you might have one or two customers, that's it, and you might be doing 2 million. That's great, but you have one or two customers and you're doing 2 million, right? You lose one, and you lose half your revenue or a significant proportion, right? I think the second thing is the expectation in the enterprise for software is going to be very high. So it might be that your development period is going to have to be a lot longer where you're not making revenue, and that's going to change things a little bit, I think, in terms of your fundraising strategy. And then I think to the point that Kate so well made, you're going to get pulled, like you're just going to get dragged by these giant companies. And you could just go significantly off your core roadmap, and that can be really dangerous as well. So, I mean, it might like I say, it's maybe an unhelpful thing to say, but if you can go mid-market and build up, once you've got some maturity in the product, I think that's probably the more ideal process.
Yeah, and Paul, I think to be fair, I've seen companies. Even when we've gone after enterprise, we close mid-market deals to validate the ICP. We're trying to get some logos in, and even in the enterprise, you can stack rank the biggest to the smallest. Maybe the only thing I would add, and I think I really like the way you said, Kate. There's things it's on my roadmap, and you're accelerating it. Bring it on. By the way, I've been involved where there's stuff that's off our roadmap, and we do it anyway because it's not that big a deal, and we want to win the deal. So, your mileage may vary. Don't do some crazy thing where you're custom R&D for your enterprise. But if there's a feature that you disagree with, if you're going to get the logo and you're going to really get $1 million deal, it's okay. The one other thing I'd say when you're doing early stage business, and these are co-development partners, I would never do any of these deals if the customer isn't willing to publicly declare their affection for me. They have to want to do some version of press release, webinar, references, logo on the website. The reason you're doing all this work is to validate that you're enterprise ready and that this prospect has selected you to make it your cost of sales on the next enterprise lower. And if they don't do this, my advice is be very careful or don't bother or charge them a lot, because you don't want to be in a position where you have a lot of secret enterprise deals that nobody will talk to each other about. That makes getting this flywheel going even harder. All right. I told you I picked the first one. Paul, did you see anything in that Q&A list that sounded pretty interesting that you wanted to jump into next?
Let's have a quick look. I think Nick Bowman's question is interesting here. So it was mentioned to focus and love on the initial customers before growing quickly. How large should this initial customer cohort be? How long to recommend delaying growth or go to market before you start ramping up sales, specifically B2B or small to mid business sales? Follow-up question: if we have product market fit with SMB clients and developing mid to large enterprise relationships, at what point should you pivot to focus to enterprise or stay focused on SMB? So quite a long question, but I think one thing I was thinking as I was reading this is I think it's important to not operate across too many sales motions at the same time. In fact, I think it's really, really important. I think you might be able to pull off two, but I've seen companies where they're trying to do SMB, mid-market, and enterprise, and that's really, really, that's really hard.
Yep.
I mean, I've spent my life in mid-market and enterprise. I don't think I would be a very good revenue leader in an SMB motion. I just wouldn't know really how to do it. I could guess, but they're so dramatically different, and the skill sets are so different. And if you're trying to do three at the same time, it's really, really hard. In terms of how many customers or how long do you recommend delaying growth? I mean, I don't think delaying growth. I wasn't really talking about delaying growth. I was just saying that before you really put your foot on the gas, you've just got to make sure that you've got good product market fit, and you've got to make sure you've got really happy customers. And probably the best way of determining that is two ways. One, what's your retention metrics like? And they've got to be really, really strong, which is going back to why I think CS is so important, because they're going to help you with that. And let's be frank, your product's going to have gaps, and CS actually sort of papers over some of those gaps as well. It can be really helpful in the early days to do that. But there's two things. What's your retention like? And also usage metrics. I think, in the past, I've missed this. I've seen good retention, but poor usage. And that doesn't work out over the long term kind of either. So I would laser in on those two things. Don't go too fast too early. Make sure you've got product market fit. Make sure you've got a good cohort of ICP clients that are getting value, and they're retaining at least 80% logo retention, ideally a bit higher. I think the other thing to say, and I think VCs do understand this, is that sometimes you'll get your early ICP wrong, right? You'll just, which is totally fine. And so you might have in a certain cohort a much higher, much poorer retention. But I think that's absolutely fine as long as you can demonstrate cohorts of very strong retention, and that's where your ICP is developed. So I think you'll be absolutely fine. So hopefully I sort of vaguely answered the question.
Yeah, I think you did, and I really like your point on thinking of the cohort. What you're trying to find is where is our sweet spot right now? I mentioned earlier in a data integration place, like finding a HIPAA problem somebody had. That's a tiny sliver of the ICP, but something that works and go after it. And that almost becomes your safe haven that you can execute on and either solve it for more different use cases or ICPs. Kate, anything you want to add to that?
Only you mentioned trying to focus as much as possible, and we talked about that earlier. Early sales, and that's what we're talking about today, should be all about focus. If and when you do decide to do multiple different segments at the same time, do your very best to really think about your customers and where there are similarities between why those customers are buying your product, and lean into those similarities. Often big enterprises want to act a lot more like small startups. And so you can find that you actually can make it a virtuous cycle to do both, as long as you're being really deliberate and recognizing that these are two very different sales cycles. I had an old mentor say, happiness is the delta between expectations and reality. And to go into a moving up market, assuming that your sales cycles are going to look anything like they did when you were SMB, or that the same resourcing path is that the resources needed to close and deploy deals will be similar, you're probably setting the team up for failure. And so really have discussions internally about what it's going to take to acquire and serve these customers. It's very important.
I want to pile on one piece here. Paul, I've been in both SMB and enterprise sales in my career. But the one thing I want to say is no customer says they're an SMB, and no customer says they're an enterprise. And, they will say what they are. I'm a bank, I'm a manufacturer, I'm a tech company, I'm a startup, I'm a dry cleaner. And really, when you're working on an ICP, you got to think about how they think of themselves, not how we put them into these bigger TAM categories. And it took a long time for me to personally figure that out. And that's why I think you're sub-selecting or dividing these markets into the smallest ones you can, that they all sound similar to each other. So when one set of developers buy, it's the rest of them that are like them want to buy, or one enterprise buys, the rest be like them matter. The only other thing I want to say on the enterprise side is that I have personal scar tissue on is when you're going after, let's say, an individual enterprise in a category, you want to make sure that the first ones you close are the ones that are going to unlock the other enterprises in that market. And I want to give an old example, but I used to sell to enterprise retail, and this was over 20 years ago, and we busted our butt for years to close a deal at Sears. And we won that deal at Sears, and we went around to talk to all the other retailers about it and department stores. And they're like, Sears, they're crappy. Like, who cares what Sears did? We almost want to do the opposite. And similarly, over a period, we put as much effort in and closed a transaction at Walmart. And we closed Walmart, and every retailer lined up behind it. Like, how Walmart did it, it slowed down it set up the buying process for everybody else. And so really be critical on the enterprise side, at not just saying how big is this company, but are they the kind of company that other people are going to follow and view as a leader in this category?
That's so funny. I closed a $1 million deal with Sears once and spent the weirdest time on their campus out near Chicago. It was just the weirdest soulless place I've ever been to on planet Earth.
Yeah, I get it. I'm not picking on anybody here who worked at Sears. I'm sure it was a great company, period. But these are the strategic decisions we have to make. Kate, any questions in the webinar Q&A that scratched an itch for you?
I work for an AI company, so I have to go to the many people asked about, are there any AI agent SDR as a service startups that we can use? There are a whole bunch out on the market. There are a whole bunch of sales tools out on the market. I would strongly recommend using ones that are built on Claude, or even just using Claude yourselves with your own SDR prep. One thing that I wouldn't do, and this is something that's so important for early sales and especially for early outbound and inbound triage, is you really want to make sure that you're being exceptionally thoughtful about the message you're sending. I don't think you should send 1,000 emails, no matter how pre-formatted they might be, no matter how good the data you get to help build those emails. I think you really want to have a very personal touch for the early outbound that you're doing, with a strong point of view on why you're reaching out to not just that company, but that individual at that company. And so I would beware of tools that are built to help you kind of blast to a wide radius early on.
Yeah. Well, so let's go a little deeper. So what I heard you say is this matters too much to get right. So don't do it too early. So when does it go from too early to now is right?
I'll go back to an example you said. You found early days, I can't remember the name of the company, but you said there was a hook. It was a person at a company that cared about HIPAA compliance. And there's probably something very specific about HIPAA compliance that they cared about, whether it was, I don't know, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but we've all sold to HIPAA compliant companies. And there are a lot of things you have to worry about when you're thinking about compliance. Nailing those specific things and the individuals who probably care most about them means that your email will be relevant and will help them to learn something. And Paul, this also goes back to the webinar point of view. How can you be a resource for your companies to help them learn something every time they talk to you? That's so important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've never really warmed to these like email sequencing like tools. I just think it just takes. I actually do like doing outbound. Like I actually, it's cool, right? It's strategic. It's got to be tactical. You got to do good research. Perhaps that's where a lot of these AI tools actually are really helpful, because they can actually maybe speed up the research time. But yeah, I think just being smart, being thoughtful about your outreach, leading with value are all, yeah, might sound a bit cliche, but they're all really, really important. I will give another little, very tiny tactical thing as well. And in my last startup, I had this incredible SDR. She then became our best AE, absolutely smashing it and beating all of the experienced AEs as well. She was amazing. We were selling to CROs, right? So we're a learning platform for revenue teams. She used LinkedIn voice notes to do her outreach. She didn't do any other outreach, did no cold calling, did nothing, because what she'd do, she would connect with, I think you can do like 150 connections a day on LinkedIn, because you can't send a voice note unless you're connected with someone. But she built, like, she was doing like 250 voice notes a week and absolutely smashed her goal. And what's interesting is you get a little play button on LinkedIn, and it's quite like, oh, what's this? Because normally you get ridiculous copy that someone sent you on LinkedIn. But this is like a voice note targeted. She did some research, and people were like, this is absolutely fantastic. And she got so many meetings. So try LinkedIn voice notes. They really get cut through.
I love that tactic. All right, we're at 5 minutes until the top of the hour, and I'm going to ask just for a quick response to the last question. And I think you each have a point of view on this, and it comes from Steve Peck, who says, what's the best way to structure a comp plan for the first sales hire, assuming you've not yet established predictable revenue, to understand what's attainable quota and what the right OTE should be? Anybody want to jump on that one first?
I'll do quick hit, very tactical. Don't put your first salespeople on variable compensation until you feel pretty confident that you've got the targets right.
And so if it's not
Yeah.
variable, what are you gonna comp them for? Are you just gonna give them 100% of their OTE, or are you gonna give them, what do you give the sign instead of the quota, if anything, Kate?
I start OTE, and then as your sales team matures, you can move to MBO, management by objective. Some people really enjoy team quotas. I think that depends on how much the team actually can co-sell together, whether or not that makes a lot of sense. And then only when you really do feel like you have a solid operating model and you can set the right expectations, that's when I think you move to full variable compensation on an individualized basis.
Thanks, Kate.
And there are certain things like the MBOs that you can actually set tasks that you want done, for sure. I would say the other thing on this question is that's why I think it's really important that you do 10 to 20 deals yourself as a founder, because actually you will have a bit of a sense of what's achievable, and perhaps you'll be in a position to set something that you feel is right. But I think you always need to be fair and adjust as you go if you do set targets as well.
Yeah, I hear you. I really like the point. I almost know when I'm hiring somebody to be first, if all they care about is the repeatable comp plan, they're probably not the right person. And there are two types, the type of people who've done multiple early stage companies like you, Paul. They get that they're here to figure it out and then pass it on. And
they love that, right? And they love that phase.
No, and I know people
you want.
The worst thing I do is repeat some formula that somebody else created. And of course, you want to find those people later on. I do like putting a little bit of, it might even be a small percentage. Kate's model I like it. I mean, we're going to make it 50% variable, but I would like to somehow put some numbers around 10% of it, because I just think it gets everybody thinking like, hey, our goal here is, like, even if it's closed deals and it's a number, and it might be a number of deals where it's an enterprise that's willing to do a press release with us, something that even reinforces what's important in the early stage of the company, rather than later stage. All right.
Yeah.
Kate, Paul.
But yeah, I think just Tony, just very last quick point. That's why it's so important when you are hiring your early reps that they've had early stage experience. It's really critical.
Yeah.
Great point.
I just want to take a moment and thank both of you for dedicating the time to this today and just sharing not just your personal experience, but what you've seen from other companies you're advising and teams you're working with. So just let me share some gratitude to both of you for joining today's webinar, and then continue that gratitude to everybody else who joined today's call. Thanks so much. We plan on sharing all of the takeaways from this conversation in an upcoming Bessemer article under our Atlas brand. We're going to answer a bunch of the other questions that we've tried to capture here in the chat online. And if you've learned something new today, be sure to share that go-to-market course with your team, your founder, or other people you know. And I'm looking forward to getting a chance to meet with many of you personally in the future. So thanks again for joining us, everybody. And I hope you have a terrific rest of your day or evening, depending on where you're at. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tony.
Bye-bye. Thanks.